Hi, this is Danielle Roessle with Inner Compass Coach, and welcome to the Inner Compass Coach podcast and virtual blog. I am so happy you're here. This podcast is dedicated to mid and senior level professionals to help them clarify their career direction and identify their next steps. I'm here today with Dan Finkel, a management consultant, and he is here to talk to us about his experience with the Inner Compass process and his experience with the realities of making a career change in regard to compensation, especially around fears of losing compensation if you were to make a career change. So, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd love to start off just having you share briefly about yourself and your professional background.
Okay. Well, thanks, Danielle. It's great to see you again. I appreciate being invited to do this, and I hope it helps people. So, career background wise, before we worked together, I spent 20 years in the education and nonprofit management world, starting off as a teacher and then sort of working my way up through various education administration roles up to principal and head of school. And after we worked together, I moved into this world of management consulting, where I work at a Big Four firm. And I'm in a sort of corner of that world called learning and leadership development. And I get to work, it's sort of under human capital, basically. I get to work with a lot of interesting agencies who are working on how do they bolster the career paths and skills of the people that work there.
Thanks for sharing. And Dan, I believe we went through the Inner Compass process together about 2 years ago. And would you share a little bit about what life was like before doing the Inner Compass process?
Sure. Yeah, I'm focused, I guess, on professional life. But if you want to talk more about life in general, I'm happy to do that too. So I was in a position when we started working together that was very meaningful for me. It was like fulfilling work, but very intense work, and work that in some ways just wasn't the greatest fit for my personality and skills. In some ways it was a fit, but in some pretty meaningful ways it wasn't. And that was challenging for me and took energy away from some of my other high priorities, most importantly, my family. So I found my work-life balance to be a little bit out of kilter, which was one of the things that was prompting this thinking about doing a career change. So I feel like life was good, and I wasn't like in a bad situation or like a really painful situation, but there was a lot of stress and there was a lot of juggling that was necessary to try to maintain like a focus on the priorities that I really care about in my life.
And what changed after completing the Inner Compass process?
Um, Lots of things, certainly. I do find myself now in a job that is a better fit for me, for the things that I like to do, and for my sort of tendencies and emotional needs and all those kinds of pieces. It's not perfect because nothing ever is, but if it was like more of a 50% fit before, I think I'm closer to an 80 or 90% fit now, which feels great. And certainly as a mid-career or sort of executive level kind of practitioner, which I was, there were things to adjust to in terms of being at a different point in the learning curve when you make a career change. So there was some initial intensity around that, but I really like learning, so that was positive in general for me. And now, a year plus into this new position, I do feel pretty comfortable. I still feel like a newbie compared to many other people my age in this world. But I also feel like excited about the path that I have ahead of me in a very different way than I think I did before.
That's wonderful. I'm really happy to hear it and absolutely thrilled. One of the biggest pieces of the Inner Compass process is taking clients back to childhood and helping them rediscover the lost parts of themselves that want to come out in their career. What was one of your biggest takeaways by going back to childhood and allowing that to guide your career change?
Um, well, first of all, I loved that part of the process very, very much. And as someone who like I'm into therapy and self-reflection in general, and those are things that I find to be healthy parts of my life. But this was also a little bit of a different perspective on that. And as a professional, I feel like I had, and maybe just in life, I feel like um, you focus on the challenges ahead of you and you think about things pretty seriously. And when you go back into those childhood memories, there's a sense, for me anyway, there was a sense of freedom and playfulness that like didn't really come out in a lot of ways in my life. A few kind of ways, but not a ton. And it certainly wasn't something that I'd ever thought of as being connected to work. um, so connecting that part of myself to how I earn an income and how I spend my time every day was really kind of an aha moment for me in a wonderful way.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That is really helpful, and hopefully for listeners, even really connecting their childhood selves the way they like to play, that should definitely be a quality that comes out in one's career. And I know I asked you specifically to come and share about your beliefs. When we were working together, one of your biggest fears was a loss of income if you were to make a career change. And one of the reasons why I invited you on is because you did such an incredible job having conversations with people who were in the careers you were interested in and really finding out the realities about income, whether it would be an increase or a loss. And I think it would really help listeners to dispel some of those myths, because I often find the reality for most of my clients is that they don't have a complete loss of income or start at ground zero. So Dan, would you be willing to share what was your experience like?
Absolutely. Um, so I think, like you're saying, one of the things that was so important in the process for me in terms of figuring out what this next step would look like or could look like was these conversations. And they served like multiple purposes, but primary certainly among those were, there's the networking component. Making connections with people who are in these fields can only help you, as you're looking for the job, and making them aware that you're having, this kind of focus in your life and thinking about what kind of next steps you're going to take professionally. But then from the outside of a field, you can only guess. So talking to somebody who's already in it, and I found asking a couple of questions. One about compensation for sure, because that was a big concern for me. I mean, I was at a point in life where I have children who are, getting to close to driving and going to college, and all these sort of financial needs and responsibilities where it would be very difficult to have taken a step back, especially a significant step back. So that was scary. Um, but then talking to people, I think what I learned was that in most fields that I was interested in, there were skills that would transfer over from my prior experience. I certainly had to learn how to talk about those skills in ways that people in the new setting would understand, because sometimes there are like language differences. But definitely what I found was that, my value as an employee was not going to go down just because I was in a new context. Not necessarily. I did certainly come into the new context in a less in a more junior position than I'd been in, which was fine. But in terms of compensation, I was able to stay basically flat and, potentially with bonuses do a little better. So, I would think I was really lucky, but I also think I was very prepared because I was able to have those conversations that you're talking about, and just straight up ask people, not ask them what they're making, but just ask like, where do you see me in your world? At what level do you think I could, work, and what do people make, in this area, geographic area, in that kind of sense. So at least I had a sense of like, where I might land. And it did dispel some of those fears. It was still scary. Lots of things about this are scary, but that's certainly one of the intense pieces.
When you had those conversations, did you find phrasing certain questions in a certain way was helpful? And if so, what questions were they more specifically?
Around this compensation
Yeah.
question. Yeah. Um, yeah, I liked to ask people to think about people who knew me pretty well in my, then context. I like to ask them to think about me, porting me over to where they work, basically. So, like, if I came to work at X company with you, what kinds of things could you see me doing, and like at what level? And what are the people who are doing that? What's their job title and what are their responsibilities, and what's the salary range? And a lot of the people that I talked to, um, had a pretty clear sense of like, what somebody in that role might be making, range wise, obviously not exactly in a lot of cases, but I think phrasing it in terms of, you're someone who knows me, imagine me out of my current context and in your context, like what could you see sort of with that flip? And that really helped me also frame what kinds of things I'd be doing in this other context that I didn't know very intimately.
I think these are really great examples of questions. And I'm going to piggyback a little further because some listeners might be talking to someone they don't know as well. And one of the things I always say is you can always say something along the lines of, here has been my background and here is where I'm looking to go. What would you suggest I target? What is the compensation more broadly?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have anything else you could add to that?
Sure. Yeah, and I did have some of those conversations, like you're saying, with people I didn't know as well. Um, I think people are generally pretty comfortable talking about this, more comfortable than we might guess, like when we sort of go into the process, just because income and compensation are these things that we kind of think of as private, I guess, or, not, we don't talk about it, at a dinner party, what we make or something like that. But in these settings, that we're, these informational interview kind of settings, it's a really normal thing to talk about. And everybody understands that you're going to need to know that as you're, making decisions. And, having been on the other end of those kinds of conversations, also, you're never, you don't want to divulge necessarily what you're making, but you can certainly give people a sense of like, here's what compensation looks like in my industry at these levels. And people are generally happy to do that. So I think kind of getting over the sense that it might be an awkward thing to talk about and just like putting that behind you if you can. And also, once you have one of these conversations, one of the things that I remember you talking about was asking who else I should speak with, sort of as an end point in these conversations. And so that was also really helpful to then, you know, get more comfortable, I guess. Like once you've asked it once, you can ask it again. And once somebody connects you to this person, then, you've sort of got to go ahead and permission to ask that question.
That's really great. And do you have any other suggestions for listeners or other tips?
Um, in terms of thinking about compensation, I think I did a little bit of homework online, also like Department of Labor kind of websites and things like that, just to get a sense of the field, in broad terms. But certainly nothing replaces these conversations. I think you get the most information and the most bang for your buck, especially because then you're also networking. Um, so yeah, I mean, my only other tip or advice, I think, is just to, if you feel like this is an uncomfortable conversation or some fear around it or something like that, like, cognitively prepare for the conversation, make some notes, think about how you're going to phrase your question, maybe practice it with somebody else, those kinds of conversational tips that can get you out of feeling a little bit awkward. Because honestly, I think most people are happy to help. They're looking for opportunities to do that.
Absolutely. Dan, this has been an incredible interview. Your advice is so valuable, and I hope that listeners who are listening to Dan's advice and suggestions really take this to heart. And what I often find is when individuals start having career conversations or informational interviews, they get easier as you continue to do them. And the more information you know, the more you are prepared when you actually get called in for that job interview.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad I got to talk about this. I really do hope it helps people. And I will say also just that, when we started, we talked a little bit about the childhood piece. And keeping that in mind, even in these career conversations, was helpful for me too. Like just remembering that, each of us has that piece inside of us, that playful kind of, fun, free piece, keeps you out of the binding mindset, I think you called it.
I did.
And that helps all of these conversations. So just kind of tapping into that, I think, as you go into them was a great piece of support that you were offered me. So I'm grateful.
Awesome. I'm grateful for you sharing. Thank you. And for listeners who have taken the time, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've gotten some really great insights and feedback on how to maintain your compensation or perhaps even increase it through our conversation with Dan. To learn more about the Inner Compass process, please visit innercompasscoach.com, INNERCOMPASS coach.com. And know that I have multiple programs to help you tap your inner compass to find your fulfilling career. Dan, once again, for joining me. And I wish everybody listening the best of luck and cheers to finding your fulfilling career.
Hear, hear. Thanks, Danielle.